Hello, I'm Stuart Sarbacker. I'll be your instructor for Yogic Studies 130, Yoga and Psychedelics. I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about my work as a scholar of yoga. So I am a professor of comparative religion and Indian philosophy at Oregon State University here in the United States. Much of my work revolves around the study of contemplative practices and bodily disciplines in the Indic context, particularly in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. I'm very much interested in the ways we can look at practice of yoga, both as an individual personal phenomenon and as one that has larger social and cultural implications. And so what brought me to the study of yoga and psychedelics was in part working on my latest book called Tracing the Path of Yoga, the History and Philosophy of Indian Mind-Body Discipline. While I was writing that book, I kept encountering connections between yogic practices and ascetic disciplines and the use of psychoactive substances. And I came out of that project, which really looks at the long arc of yoga's history and philosophy, thinking that someone really needed to look more deeply at the connection between yoga, psychoactive substances, and ultimately psychedelics. At the same time, I was doing some ethnographic field work among technologists in Silicon Valley and was deeply impressed by the ways in which contemporary cultures of biohacking and human engineering are engaging with the emerging psychedelic renaissance. That in turn led to a deep dive into the new frontier of psychedelic facilitator training. And last year I completed the InnerTrek psilocybin facilitator program, the first program in the country offering licensing training for psilocybin facilitators here in Oregon. So the first state-approved program. I'm also, as a scholar of Indian philosophy and religion, very interested in the connection between psychoactive substances and religious experience. And so that's a deep and abiding interest that I bring as an academic to this field. Personally, I'm both a practitioner of yoga and a scholar of yoga, and thus it was not too big of a jump for me to kind of look into this more scholar practitioner side of things with regard to the psychedelic renaissance. And so the course itself is designed in part to look at both these larger historical and cultural issues, as well as get to the integration of yoga into contemporary psychedelic cultures and look at the linkages between contemporary practice and the use of psychedelics. So the course itself is broken down into 4 modules. And the idea is we start by kind of looking at the big picture, and particularly the relationship between the use of psychoactive substances and different spiritual and religious cultures and subcultures around the globe. Building on that foundation, then we turn towards looking at what these different substances do to the body and brain, with a focus on the sort of classical serotonergic psychedelics, including LSD, DMT, psilocybin, and mescaline. I'm very much interested as a scholar in the ways in which psychoactive substances have been deeply woven into cultures throughout the world, and issues in terms of things like ethnopharmacology, the relationship between cultures and these substances that transform consciousness. And so the bottom line is, for that first unit, we'll be looking at a kind of a broad literacy with respect to what I see as the pervasive role of psychoactive substances, including psychedelics, in human history and culture, with an emphasis ultimately on looking at traditions of yoga and their relationship with these substances. Module 2, I've titled The Vedic Foundations, Soma, Bhisha, and the Upanishads. And so this module really explores the early strata of Indian religious history in the context of the Vedic tradition, particularly the role of Soma, this famous elixir used in Vedic ritual, and the notion of a visha, a poison or agent that is connected in the Rig Veda to the practices of Caitians or long-haired ascetics. We'll look at Soma in light of the considerable scholarly controversy over identifying what exactly Soma was or is, as well as the notion that Soma becomes a kind of category that is a catch-all for talking about substances that have a purpose within the transformation of the person through ritual and contemplative practices. The last part of that segment will look particularly at the Upanishads, in part looking at theories that argue the emergence of yoga as a formal discipline may have been a substitute for a Soma tradition of the forest that was disappearing. And we'll look, in my opinion, critically at this for various reasons, while at the same time entertaining the idea of the relationship between the kind of mystical philosophical content of the Upanishads and the role of Soma and other psychoactive agents within the Vedic tradition. Module 3 gets more deep into the formal and systematic relationship between classical and medieval traditions of yoga and the use of psychoactive, if not psychedelic substances. We'll focus particularly in the first part of that unit on the concept of the Oshadi or herb, specifically within the Patanjali yoga philosophy, the Yoga Sutra and Yoga Shastra of Patanjali, and its relationship to Buddhist notions in which the use of Oshadi or herbs is associated with obtaining extraordinary powers of action and perception. I will highlight in particular the role of the concept of the nirmana chitta, literally the constructed mind that comes about through not only the use of herbs, but through the use of other things like mantras, ritual practices, as well as meditation and contemplation. We'll look a bit at the connection between Oshadi in the yoga context and Oshadi in the context of Ayurveda, before turning to the larger medieval scope in which we see traditions around cannabis, or bhanga in Sanskrit, and datura, or dhatura, in the various traditions of medieval, especially tantric forms of yoga and sadhu traditions. In the end, we'll come back around to looking again at the idea of Soma as a kind of catch-all term to talk about the ways that substances are seen to have a power or potency or a sacred role within the context of religious practice. The last unit, which is entitled Psychoactives and Psychedelics in Modern and Contemporary Yoga, looks at the ways in which the cultures of yoga and their relationship with psychoactive substances, and again with psychedelics, has been transformed from the late 19th through the 20th and into the mid-20th, or I should say early 21st century. One of the things I will focus on is the ways in which one might argue that yogic practice, ascetic practice, was sanitized, particularly with respect to the use of cannabis in Indian asceticism, and the shift from the use of more psychoactive or more psychedelic psychoactive agents to more stimulating agents within cultures of modern yoga. We'll talk a bit about the ways that important modern yoga teachers, such as Swami Shivananda and B.K.S. Iyengar, talked about the role of herbs or drugs within contemporary yogic culture. And then we'll turn in the last segment towards a kind of deep dive into both the first and second wave psychedelic movements of the United States and their relationship on one hand with an emerging psychedelic therapeutic culture that was tied very deeply into the disciplines of psychiatry and psychology. And on the other hand, the intimate link between the use of psychoactive substances, and perhaps especially psychedelics, within the global counterculture that was coming out of Europe and the United States in that era. We'll look at the ways that the first wave laid the foundation for the so-called second wave psychedelic movement or psychedelic renaissance. And the linkages, the deep linkages, actually, one might say, between the therapeutic cultures around psychedelics and the ongoing role of psychedelics in exploration and experimentation among yogic practitioners, both in Hindu-inspired movements and in Buddhist-inspired movements. So in sum, we're going to be looking at kind of a big picture here of the relationship between yoga, psychoactives, and psychedelics. And I think it'll be a lot of fun to go through this material. There's a lot of really provocative ideas for thinking both academically about the history and philosophy of yoga, and at the same time, to think about the ways in which psychedelics might be intimately connected, intimately related to the practice of yoga within the contemporary context. So I'm looking forward to seeing you over the coming weeks, and I will be in touch with you soon. Thank you.